My name is Nicholas Karn, and I'm in the History Department at the University of Southampton. I'm going to talk today about something that's really important for my own research and for the work I do within the department. That is castles. I'm going to give something that's meant as a sort of flavour of a module that I teach for the first years in the format of a mini lecture. In a sense, castles don't need that much introduction. They are very well known, and most people have some experience and some knowledge about what they are. Most people indeed have probably visited them at some point or another, and some of the major examples are really important parts of the heritage industry in this country. So we can think about somewhere such as Dover, an enormous fortress which attracts people from far and wide as a good example of this. Castles have even passed into popular culture, so that there are ideas about the Gothic, even about Disney, where castles are really significant elements. And there they've got all kinds of meanings about age, about wealth, and so forth, that are still values, are still ideas that have significance in our society. Castles, as part of the heritage industry, are fun, and they are something that mean a lot to many people. But in a sense, what I'd like to do today is to go a little bit beyond that and to go a little bit deeper, to at least suggest some of the themes and some of the ideas that we might use to think about castles in a slightly more organised way, and to try to understand how it is that they could fit into the societies that produce them. Because if we do try to do this, we'll understand them to a greater level of depth, and also we'll be able to place them in relation to the ambitions, the interests, the culture of the people who actually created them. Because I think they are particularly important as being useful windows that let us understand particular past societies. If you want to understand castles, then the starting place, in many ways, is a really obvious one. We need to know what a castle is. We could state the question in slightly different ways. How do we know if a particular building is a castle or is not? We could approach this by looking at sort of distinctive features that are characteristic of them, let's say walls or towers, and which would set them apart from other kinds of buildings like houses and churches. This, though, while it has a certain appeal, doesn't take us very far, because some of the kinds of structures that we can see as being typical of castles can occur in other kinds of buildings. So the picture you can see there is a local example. This is the medieval bar gate in the town walls of Southampton. As you can see, that's a pretty complicated structure. It's built in many phases from the 12th to the 15th century. But it was never part of a castle. It's a kind of ceremonial entrance to the town. It's something which could be used to close the town if there were an attack. It's something which is important to the residents of the medieval town. It's also important to the trade of the town because tolls are levied on carts as they pass in and out of it. But if our definition of castle included things like this, then we'd end up with quite a peculiar definition. Instead, what we can focus on as being really important about castles is how they're used and who uses them. That actually the form of the structures is a little bit secondary. The point about castles, what sets them apart from walls on fortified towns, is that castles are private. Unlike a town to which anyone could go to buy things and to trade, castles are private structures, and they're things which are meant more or less for an elite. They are occupied by kings, by aristocrats, and other members of the elites of the societies which produce them. And that private attribute is something that's really important. Most people would, in the Middle Ages, would never have been allowed access into castles unless perhaps they were delivering some something. So this is about who is using the structures itself. One of the other obvious things we can use to identify a castle is quite simply if people call it a castle. And here there are some really interesting patterns, because there are words that signify castle in the English language and in other European languages as well. They appear at about the same moment in time in all kinds of different languages where they hadn't existed with those meanings before. And they appear at about the end of the 10th century or about the start of the 11th. And that shift in language is something that sort of helps a lot to think about it. Because, of course, there are much older fortifications that look a bit castle-like. The slide I put up there shows part of the Roman walls at Portchester in Hampshire, again not that far from Southampton. We can see that they're Roman from some of the features we can see there, such as the horizontal bands of tiles that are used to bind the walls together. But this, of course, is not something that's a private structure as the Romans used it. Instead, this is probably a kind of customs post, something that was meant to regulate, control and tax trade between the south coast of Britain and continental Europe. And indeed, if we look at sort of Roman civilization overall, we can see that they don't really use castles. There is a very wealthy elite in Rome itself, but they tend to gather in urban palaces or rural villas, not in fortified residences. So the fact that the elite in the Middle Ages built a fortified residence, where earlier elites hadn't, that again is telling us something about how the elite think about themselves, how they think about the threats presented by the world around them, and also how far they're kind of militarized, that they understand the world in terms of threat and the kind of skills in handling weapons or in commanding troops that they had to deal with it. So it's immediately telling us something about how the rulers of this society think about the world around them and how it changes at a particular moment in time and is very different from what much older elites had. We can also use this sort of a comparative approach to look to where we might see castles elsewhere, because if they turn up at sort of at a particular moment in time across much of Europe, we can also look to other parts of the world and see that this idea of this sort of private fortified structure, a fortified residence, is not the norm there either. So, for instance, if we were to look at the Islamic world, we can see castles there, but they're relatively rare. They're often built by crusaders or by Islamic leaders who are responding to the crusaders and trying to use the same technology to deal with them. We don't really see a kind of indigenous tradition of castle building. The one place where we can see a tradition of private fortified residences that are really very similar to European castles is Japan. And Japanese castles, quite interestingly, arise from exactly the same position. They're built as private residences, as private structures by members of the elite. The elite are very committed to a kind of military lifestyle, skill in arms, and military culture, and use their castles as bases from which they could dominate the landscape around them. Direct links between medieval Europe and medieval and early modern Japan are a bit distant, but nevertheless we have similar societies with similar kinds of social structures which end up adopting quite similar solutions to problems that were common to the pair of them. We can think about castles as being military structures, and clearly we need to think about how far they are designed with military matters in mind. But actually to be involved in warfare is something that isn't necessarily part of their histories. There are many castles which, as far as we can tell from historical sources, were never attacked. that their defences were a statement of identity, that their defences were a deterrent to potential attackers, but they were never actually caught up in the business of fighting. So simply trying to trace military action as a determinant doesn't really help you. Instead, we need to think about the importance of military style and of the sort of practices that go with it as being the most important things. But I think the sort of key thing to note here is that castles are not a universal. There's something that arise in certain kinds of societies at certain times, and which respond to particular internal and external problems. Other societies never develop a kind of castle tradition, and that tells us something really significant about how it is that they work and how it is that they are structured. So castles in Europe have a kind of era, a kind of period when they're built and used, and when new ones are being put together and old ones are being brought up to date. It runs basically from the 11th century to about the 17th. In terms of English history, you might think about that as being sort of the Norman conquest to the English Civil War. That's a long period of time, though, and across that we can see that castles develop quite markedly and change in that period. And those changes are about the technology of castles. And that's what I want to turn to next. This is an example of an early castle. So this is Christchurch, again on the south coast, not that far from Southampton. I put that in there because it gives an impression that this is a hilly thing, that the core, the heart of this castle is a large artificial mound which was created using human labour. Later on, it had a stone tower put on top of it, and what we're looking at there is part of the slope of the mound with the ruins of the tower itself. This is characteristic of many early castles. They are very basic. They don't have the kind of elaborate walls and towers or the great halls and comfortable accommodation we might see a couple of hundred years after. They include really quite sort of elementary defensive structures. Often these include ditches or maybe water-filled moats. They could include banks made of earth to try to stop anyone breaking into it. Commonly, these are topped with wooden walls rather than stone ones at an early date. The motte is often the centre of the castle, and this is an artificial hill, or sometimes it's kind of sculpted or adapted from an older existing earthwork. These are ones which let the owners do certain things. They offer a kind of security, even if obviously a much lesser one than what happens later on. They let the owners dominate part of the landscape and announce their status and how they were the leaders of a particular part of local society. The motte with the tower on top of it could also be a kind of refuge in the event of attack. That sense that they are coming out of a situation where the owners are fearful about attacks or threats from outside links them to the political circumstances around them. These include the insecurity of Normans in the aftermath of the Norman conquest, when they could be murdered or attacked by the English, but also the ways in which kinds of warfare between members of the elite could take place. There is a kind of expectation of violence that could take place, and also there's the sense of sort of when so many people are trained in how to use arms, most people potentially could be a threat to someone else. So these early castles are a protection against that, and they kind of work because the technology to build them is not very large. If you are a Norman lord, you could build earthworks. You just need lots of peasants to dig stuff. The slide there shows Old Sarum Castle near Salisbury, not far from here. And I put that one in to show how big some of these earthworks could be. You can see from the picture the scale in terms of some people, the trees, and the bridge. A lot of human labour has gone into making that. And a lot of it, presumably, is forced labour, whereby peasants and farmers from the area around are brought together and forced to dig this. But it doesn't require skills in terms of stonemasonry, cutting stone, in terms of designing structures, or anything like that. It just requires the ability to mobilise human muscle power. These early castles are effective because their technology is quite basic, but also because the siege techniques, the attack techniques that could be used against them, similarly, are not very advanced. So where we can see castles being attacked in historical sources, the kind of techniques used are fire to burn down wooden walls, attempt to sort of climb over those wooden walls using ladders or other supports, or simply blockading them to try to starve out the inhabitants. So these early wood and earth castles make sense because there's not really that much that can be used against them. But what we need to think about is how the techniques for attack develop over time, so that what we might think about is there almost being a kind of arms race in which attackers develop new techniques and new technologies, and then castle builders and castle designers come to invent new structures which could counteract them. So that there's that sense of there being something of a technological struggle, a technological war there. The picture you can see there shows an early way in which this took place. Obviously, this is a modern reconstruction now at Dover Castle, but what this is something that follows designs for trebuchet, which is a kind of throwing device that spreads widely across Europe in the late 12th, early 13th centuries. You can see there's a big solid frame. There's an arm, which is here vertical, and which could hold at one end of it something like a heavy stone or a boulder that could be thrown against walls. And there's a weighting mechanism which could act as something that, when released, would sort of move the arm violently and throw the boulder towards the walls. This is quite an effective form of artillery in an era before gunpowder's been invented. Sometimes historical sources that describe attacks on castles could indicate that attackers could have multiple examples of these things, all throwing large, damaging objects at castle walls. So, once these things are in use, let's say in the later 12th century, then clearly older styles of wood and earth castle are not going to last very long. They're no longer effective against many of the technologies that can now be used to attack them. At the same time, not everyone can afford to update, because many of the techniques that are used to update castles and to make them proof against things like trebuchets are beyond the resources of many castle owners. So if you look at some castles from this period, we can see Portchester here again. We can see here the Great Keep. This is this enormous stone tower. It has massive, thick walls. We can also see how there are the great perimeter walls of the castle. In the case of Portchester, the old Roman walls of the Roman customs post are reused and in places extended. But in many other places, castle owners would have to build new ones. Another thing that we can see developing in this period is complicated gatehouses. This shows the Constable's Gate at Dover, and I think you can sort of see, just from looking at this picture, how this is a complicated structure. The gate isn't just a doorway. Instead, it's sort of a complicated process in which someone trying to get into the castle has to pass through a series of barriers. any of which could be defended militarily. So this is a very major obstacle to anyone trying to get into the castle by any means at all. To build things like this gatehouse at Dover, you needed skilled masons, people who were skilled in building in stone, and who could also design and think through a complicated structure like the Constable's Gate. You also needed supplies of stone, and in many cases these would have to be brought in from some distance away. For a lot of the stonework at Dover, for instance, it's actually quarried much further down the Kent coast and brought in by ship. So all these things mean that to build these kind of new improved castles, it's only the wealthiest in society who could do them. Many local knights and local lords who had once been able to afford a wooden earth one can't keep up in this arms race between siege techniques and improvements in castle defences. So what this means is that as the Middle Ages goes on, the number of castles in use declines. So that increasingly there are these big major fortresses owned by the wealthiest, and a lot of the lesser castles kind of drop out of being of any active military values. This kind of process really goes on from a very extended period. And perhaps one of the biggest step changes in this is the appearance of gunpowder. It first appears in Europe in military uses in the early 14th century, and it develops fairly rapidly thereafter, so that by the 15th century you've got large cannons that are capable of damaging or demolishing castle walls. Again, castle designers respond and come up with new designs that are effective against cannons and other gunpowder weapons. A good case in point is this castle at Deal in Kent, a bit further along the coast from Dover. And you can see how different it is from the much older Dover castle. It's built low so that it doesn't present a big target to cannons. This is very different from older castles, which often build their walls very high to make them more proof against attack using ladders or other scaling weapons. You can also see how cannons are incorporated into it. So instead of tall towers, you've got these sort of much lower solid structures called bastions, which form a kind of base on which cannons could be placed to fire outwards. In many ways, this is a kind of castle technology which is really incompatible with older castles. And we can see that sort of while someone like the king could afford to create things like Deal Castle at places that were seen to be of significance for national defence, most lords who owned castles couldn't really afford to, and therefore generally didn't, carry out the kind of schemes needed to modernise their castles to make them proof against artillery weapons. So that sense of sort of the arms race over castles is an important thing in terms of thinking about how they change and how they develop, but that's not the only story. Castles, as mentioned earlier, were also residences. They're places where the elite live, and so they have accommodation inside them. Early castles, these sort of wood and earth structures, often have quite basic accommodation, often halls and sort of large spaces that will be used for different functions. But these are not lavish accommodation blocks. What we see in the late Middle Ages, in the 14th century and 15th century, is a move towards more elaborate accommodation that kind of shows a rather different lifestyle going on within the castle itself. The picture I put up there shows a 14th century set of buildings within Porchester Castle. This was built for King Richard II, and it consists of a series of buildings which have different functions. There are kitchens there, there's a small hall for the king to use, but behind that there are private chambers and rooms where the king could spend time away from the people who follow him, and where he could be among people who he trusted and wished to spend time with. So this is sort of something built for the king, but it's actually something that can be seen in many other castles. That even many lords who still own castles start building more private rooms, more private chambers, and private bedrooms in this period. So the castles often fill up with these structures, and they almost sort of domesticate the castle. So that now, instead of being sort of quite a militarized looking structure, they now take on a more sort of house-like look. And this urge to try to fill castles with comfortable accommodation is something that's a bit at odds with the kind of designs that we saw at Deal for how to cope with gunpowder weapons. If you need to build your castles low, with these big solid bastions for cannons, it's a bit hard to fit in lots of private rooms and halls and all the rest of it. So that sense that kind of what people want in terms of lifestyle and what people need in terms of defensive structures are heading in different directions is something that we can see in castles in the 16th and 17th century, whereby increasingly castle owners have to choose, and most choose to go for comfortable accommodation instead of defence. So that in a sense we can sort of see there the beginning of the end of the castle as a kind of military structure. So I'll just make a couple of concluding remarks at this point. We've seen that castles are well known; they're important features in the heritage industry. But I think what's interesting too is that they are major historical sources, and we should insist on that, and that as being an important point. That they're not just things we can read about in documents, but we can look at them, look at their walls, the way that they're built, and what we can tell about the way they're used. Actually, they are historical sources in themselves, and we can read them in those terms. But what they tell us about is many different things. We can see there how they're sort of driven by changing technology, and how there are things such as trebuchets and cannons that help to sort of form a context that castle designers have to respond to. And we can also see how they show a lot about the culture in which they live, in which we can see how it is that changing ideas about lifestyle, about the demand for privacy and private accommodation, helps to shape the way they develop, and what it is that we can see today in castle remains. So that therefore they tell us so much about how society and culture develop over time. And so if you want to think about past societies as historians, castles are really important sources.